What is going on, everybody? I'm Justin Taylor, and as you know, there has been non-stop talk about all the stimulus checks lately and updates around the new stimulus proposals that keep popping up. We have the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act, which would basically do as the name implies. We have the Emergency Money for the People Act, which would give most Americans $2,000 a month, and now the CARES Act 2, which is still in its early stages, but could be an additional $3 trillion bill. It'll be interesting to see how all this plays out and which of these proposals actually get passed in the coming weeks, but that's not what this video is about. This video is about looking at the stimulus money that's been given to us so far and what kind of impact that money's had over the last few weeks. Now, if you've seen any of my recent videos, you know that I've taken a more negative point of view when looking at these stimulus plans, mainly focusing on how these stimulus plans will drive up inflation, increase taxes, and add to our national debt. But of course, with how the economy is looking and how all businesses and companies, big and small, have been impacted, and the fact that over 30 million people are now unemployed, the government definitely has to take measures to try to turn things around. It's been over a month now since the original CARES Act was passed, and as a reminder, the CARES Act was the $2 trillion stimulus plan that provided small businesses with loans, bailed out many large corporations, and provided the majority of Americans with $1,200 stimulus checks. Specifically looking at the $1,200 that went out to individuals, I personally have been eagerly waiting to see what kind of impact this money would have on the economy and how effective it would be at actually doing what it was intended for. And today, I think I have some pretty interesting insight to share with you guys. So when we received that $1,200, we basically had three options, right? You could spend it, use it to buy a little bit of weed and some video games because hey, you're stuck at home and there's nothing else to do, right? You can invest it because if this whole situation has taught us anything, it's that you need to be smart with your money so that you're prepared for an emergency. Or you could save it because the stock market has been pretty unpredictable, and with so many people getting laid off, it's not a bad idea to have a little cushion of extra money as a backup. Of these three options, it was predicted that most people would do the third option here and save it, which would have not really benefited the economy. But in fact, it turns out that the majority of people did use it in a way that helps stimulate the economy. Not every eligible person has received their money yet, but for those that have, most have spent it primarily on bills or essential items, while less than a quarter of people have chosen to put it into their savings. A study done by Northwestern University found that stimulus recipients utilized their money very quickly. On average, people spent roughly a third of the government-issued funds within 10 days of receiving it. And what was discovered, this is actually quite sad when you think about it, the speed at which that money was spent wasn't related to people's incomes or whether or not they were unemployed, but rather the speed at which this money was spent was most associated to a person's liquidity, meaning those with less money in their bank accounts when the checks arrived tended to spend more of their check right away. Those with $500 or less in their bank account, which keep in mind is most of Americans, spent bigger proportions of that money at a much quicker rate compared to those with higher amounts of money in the bank. And what did they spend it on? During past recessions, a significant portion of stimulus checks went to big consumer purchases like electronics, furniture, new cars, which believe it or not, new cars was a pretty common purchase in 2008. Today, however, in 2020, much more of that spending is going towards groceries and catching up on rent and bills. I came across a study that found that 80% of people consider this money to be important to their financial well-being right now. And you can view this from many different ways, but the fact is, a lot of people don't have a lot of money. But while the stimulus did generate stimulation in the economy and it did help a lot of people, it doesn't necessarily mean it was a complete success. The general consensus is that the amount of money provided in the first round of stimulus wasn't enough. It didn't provide enough money to households in the form of those direct payments, and the government didn't act as quickly as it probably should have. I mean, the real level of success of that first $2 trillion that was pumped into the economy is really up for debate. When you look at the amount of job loss and businesses that have closed, it's easy to say that the federal government's efforts were a complete failure, especially when you start digging into a lot of how the funds were managed and dispersed. A lot of small businesses got the short end of the stick, horribly managed corporations were rewarded, and perhaps worst of all, our poor sex workers were banned from getting any financial assistance. But what is certain is that the CARES Act provided much better results compared to the alternative of the government not doing anything at all. And looking at the stock market, while it's being artificially inflated at the moment and many claim that the stock market is a bubble on the verge of bursting, the stimulus plan has played an important role in supporting supporting some of the growth that we've seen in the market over the last few weeks. But what can we learn from the first round of stimulus? The goal is to raise the fiscal multiplier, right? Which is a formula that measures the effect that increases in fiscal spending will have on a nation's economic output, or GDP. Going back to that study by Northwestern that I referenced earlier, they found that the best way for direct household stimulus payments to be effective is, of course, by getting people to spend that money in order to get it circulated into the economy quickly. This may cue up some political debate here, but Northwestern found that it would make most sense to target people based on their liquidity. In other words, tightening up the requirements and only giving money to those most economically vulnerable and those with the lowest amount of cash on hand, since those people would be most likely to immediately spend the money. And this has already been proven to be the case from what we've seen so far. And a boost to unemployment insurance might have an even larger effect on consumer spending compared to stimulus payments, since the unemployment insurance is typically targeted towards people who likely have lower wealth and income anyways. But as we're starting to see, a lot of people are making more money on unemployment than they did when they were working, which could lead to a big decline in productivity. I mean, it's like, who would want to go back to work when you're making more money on unemployment, right? So overall, I'd say that the first round of stimulus money was a success. If not from its slight bump in economic activity and increased spending, then definitely in the way of providing those who are struggling with some additional financial support. This is a very unique situation we're in, and I think the initial phases of the CARES Act were definitely a learning experience. So it'll be interesting to see the final details of some of the other plans that are currently on the table and how future money and loans will be doled out. In the coming weeks, as the remaining people receive their stimulus funds and many states start to open up and possibly more money is distributed, I hope to do another video on how household spending habits are changing and another look at the role of stimulus money in driving that spending. But for now, that's it for this one. Like, sub, watch. Until next time, peace.